Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Janat Jalil, and I'm joined from Jerusalem by our correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher. And Barbara, the renewed violence between the US and Iran has seen Gulf countries again come under attack from Iranian drones and missiles. What's the reaction been in the region?
Well, I mean, it's put the Gulf states back on the front line, hasn't it? There had been a flare-up of violence before, after the ceasefire deal was signed, but this one has been much more extensive and much more damaging. You've had, on the U.S. side, more than 170 targets in Iran. And from the Iranian side, they have fired missiles and drones at what they said were U.S. targets in Bahrain and Kuwait and Qatar, even Jordan, which is not usually in the line of fire. Now, almost all of those were intercepted, but still, this is really quite alarming and frustrating for Iran's neighbors because, first of all, it raises the specter of a return to war. And these countries, their economies are still struggling to recover from the war itself. You know, the hit on the oil and gas industry, the tourism, the international travel, all of that is still struggling to recover. And the other thing is, this is upending efforts to try to open the Strait of Hormuz, which is very essential for the oil and gas industry exports as well. Now, this all started with Iran targeting a number of ships in the Strait of Hormuz, including some from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. That prompted a very angry call from the Qatari prime minister to the Iranian foreign minister, but he also had phone calls with other regional leaders urging a return to diplomacy because they really are very desperate to contain this.
So this has exposed just how vulnerable the Gulf states are to Iran. Iran says it's attacking them because they host US bases. Do you think there's a chance that some of these states, at least, could be reconsidering their relationship with the US and perhaps asking US troops to leave?
Well, I think they might consider expanding their security alliances. So, for example, during the war, they really talked up the support they were getting from European and British militaries. But frankly, to be realistic, they have invested a lot into the U.S. security umbrella, and there isn't really an equal alternative anywhere. So China, for example, is their biggest economic partner, but it doesn't offer the same kind of military alternative. Neither does Russia. And also, the way they were attacked by Iran, Iran wasn't just hitting U.S. military infrastructure. The Gulf states said it was also hitting civilian infrastructure and residential areas. And so to some degree, at least during the war, that was helping them to close ranks with the U.S. Now, having said that, the MOU, the Iran-U.S. ceasefire deal, doesn't address one of their main concerns, which is Iran's ballistic missile program, because the Gulf states and also Israel have been at the receiving end of these missiles, and they really wanted this to be part of negotiations to end the war. But it's not mentioned at all, and that is something that the Gulf states really see as an omission. And also, you've had now two escalations, this one quite severe, and that sort of increases their worst fear, which is maybe there won't be able to be an ultimate resolution between the U.S. and Iran. Maybe it will continue in this sort of vein of stop and start violence. And so that would mean that the region would remain volatile.
And let's say this stop and start violence does continue. What is the likely impact on the oil and gas exports of the Gulf states?
Well, it's really going to be detrimental to that. So what's happened is the Memorandum of Understanding between Iran and the U.S. says that Iran will allow the passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, but the main route is not usable because of mines, and the Iranians have committed to removing those mines. But in the meantime, they have said you've got to use this route next to our coastline. Now, across the strait is Oman, and it has also opened a route together with the International Maritime Organization, an alternate route, and the U.S. has been providing air cover for that. And the Iranians say, well, that alternate route hasn't been approved by us, and therefore they have been hitting ships that have been taking that Omani route, including the Saudis and the Qataris. And so now what's happened is that the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is advising that people should stop using the strait, that the ships should stop going through the strait at this point. This is the main export route for gas and oil from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. In particular, Qatar doesn't really have another route to export its liquefied natural gas. So this is an existential economic issue for them. I think what probably will happen is that this will accelerate efforts which have already been underway to diversify, that is, to create new routes overland from the Gulf to the Mediterranean via pipelines, via railway links, and so on. That has already begun, especially encouraged by the war, because, an Iranian blockade of the Hormuz Strait was always sort of seen as this doomsday scenario that would never happen. Well, it's happened. And now that sort of Hormuz genie has come out of the bottle, it can't be put back in. There will always be the risk of a closure. And so I think what you'll see is an acceleration of attempts to create other ways to export gas and oil, because really this is absolutely crucial for the Gulf economies.
Weren't the Gulf countries supposed to be involved in sorting out the administration of the strait?
Yes, they were. What the MOU said is that Iran should meet with Oman and other countries that are along the coastline, and they should come up with a protocol for the administration of the Strait of Hormuz in line with international law and in line with the rights of coastal states. And in fact, that had already started. The Qatari Prime Minister visited Oman last month to try and get those negotiations underway. And at the time, diplomats said the main issue was the question about the transit fee. So there's never been a fee for ships crossing through the Strait of Hormuz, but there were many indications that Iran was planning to try and put one in place. And so the Gulf countries were going to push against some kind of transit fee. And it was thought that the Iranians would come up with a sort of variant, like you need to pay a fee for environmental reasons or for security reasons or whatnot. But that has all been put on hold now because it's not clear if the U.S. and Iran will return to negotiations. And without that, you're not going to have these regional sort of separate streams continue.
So it seems that the chances of a regional diplomatic solution are dimming.
I think that's a good way to put it at this point anyway, given what we've seen in the past week. Now, there were reports that the Saudis were going to organize a regional summit, sort of like a reconciliation summit, to try and mend ties between the Gulf states and Iran. And there's a history of tense ties between Iran and the Gulf states. Some Gulf states more than others, but, for example, Saudi Arabia and Iran had started this rapprochement before the war. Now, that's obviously been put on hold, and you can say that there's a lot more to mend now than there was before, but that isn't going to happen unless there's a cessation of hostilities. And so really this regional stream is dependent on the relations between the U.S. and Iran, and it's not clear if the U.S. and Iran agreement will lead to a cessation of hostilities. What this escalation has really exposed again is how intractable the issue of the Strait of Hormuz is. The Iranians are determined to keep control of it because it's a really valuable card for them to be able to disrupt the global economy when they want to. The Americans are determined to try and stop them, or at least respond to them when they strike ships. But at the same time, President Trump really needs the Strait of Hormuz open in order to bring oil prices down. So it's believed that neither side wants a return to war, but at the same time, given the sort of volatile relationship and conditions, it's not clear that ultimately over time they will be able to prevent one or even be willing to prevent one.
Barbara, thank you. That was our correspondent, Barbara Plett-Usher in Jerusalem. And if you want to hear more from the Global News Podcast, please click on the link below.